Tale Foundry. Alright, so last week we talked about what genres are and how weird fiction allows us to experiment with them. To spin something new and interesting from those long-standing and sometimes stale conventions. But the deeper you delve into it, the stranger weird fiction becomes. Of course, we're all made of pistons and gears. We can handle it without getting too disturbed. But you, our fleshy human friends, you might want to brace yourselves. Things are about to get weird. Here are 5 of the strangest subgenres of weird fiction. Number 5. Imagine a world built on churning metal and hissing steam, a place where iron airships cast their shadows on clockwork cities, where technology is so convoluted that machines and magic are almost indistinguishable from each other. Imagine it. What you're seeing is a glimpse into the minds of mad inventors and machinists of the imagination, those writers and lovers of what we call steampunk. It might surprise some of you to see it on this list. I mean, it places such a heavy emphasis on technology, how could it be anything other than science fiction? Well, it is science fiction, but that doesn't stop it from being weird fiction too. We'll talk about this more further down the list, but this is actually what makes steampunk so cool to us. Traditional science fiction is all about the implications of scientific or technological progress, and while science and technology are important to steampunk, they aren't what you would call progressive. In the context of steampunk, science tends to be archaic and outdated, more of a strange human fixation than a means of introspection. For science fiction, that's pretty weird. Since this genre has become so popular in recent years, and definitely not because we're totally crazy about it, we'll probably do a full steampunk month at some point in the future, so look forward to that. It's on the horizon. Number 4. At this point, pretty much everyone is familiar with fantasy, right? We've all seen the dragons and the magic, the made-up creatures and the imaginary mythologies. It's not new and it's not weird, but it's still pretty great. And with the massive spectrum of fantasy subgenres out there, it would be a gross understatement to say that fantasy offers some good variety. But there is one aspect of the genre that stays pretty consistent across the board: escapism. Whether it be high fantasy or urban fantasy, epic fantasy or teen fantasy, pretty much all of it has to do with getting away from the mundanity of the real world. Although, that wasn't always the case. Before fantasy met the crucible of niche marketing, or actually before fantasy was even a thing at all, it went through a lot of phases. One of its earliest incarnations was just stories about fantastical stuff showing up in the real world. Manic ghosts coming back to haunt the living, mythological figures visiting our world, ancient occult rituals designed to draw the attention of sleeping eldritch horrors. But even though they were a sort of stepping stone toward the genre, those things are all relatively strange for fantasy, because instead of accepting those elements as part of the story, we're made to grapple with their intrusion into our world. Today we call this strange marriage of fantasy and realism by the simple term Fantastique. Number 3. As a genre grows in popularity, as writers realize there's a market for it, that genre will often begin to stagnate. The hallmarks of the genre will slowly overtake the soul of it, until, when it finally becomes mainstream, it's little more than a collection of specific, predictable elements painted onto a story. This certainly isn't the case for every genre, but a lot of people thought that science fiction was going this direction back in the 80s. One author in particular, Bruce Sterling, thought it was such a problem that he wrote a famous article about it, praising those writers who dared to deviate, the ones who missed the mainstream and fell into what he called Slipstream. Because the whole point of Slipstream is to defy market genre, it's a pretty difficult genre to define. But there is one common thread throughout Slipstream stories: a heavy emphasis on cognitive dissonance, eliciting feelings of doubt and uncertainty from the audience. In the words of Bruce Sterling himself, think MC Escher, and you have a graphic equivalent. Number 2. You might expect weird fiction to be the epitome of weird in fiction, but it turns out the rabbit hole goes a lot deeper, and fair warning, it's not Wonderland you're going to find down there. Thanks to the magic of the internet, no one really has to be alone anymore, no matter how bizarre their interests. If you want to write about gory fetishes and supernatural sex jokes, plots and premises so absurd no respectable publisher would ever bat an eyelash at them, you can! There's a place for you. A fascinating freak show of a genre, a caricature of weird fiction, host to such titles as The Haunted Vagina and This Book is Full of Spiders. We call it Bizarro fiction, and for good reason. It's grotesque, absurd, wildly perturbing, all entirely on purpose. And that is the amazing thing about this genre. Where all those other types of weird fiction subvert genre ideals, Bizarro fiction subverts society itself, shrugging off the constraints of decency and rationality in order to present us with a unique, albeit pretty freaky, experience. Number 1. It's hard to get weirder than Bizarro, but we've actually been hiding something from you this whole time that may blow your mind. The weird fiction genre doesn't really exist. And that's because weird is a relative term, an adjective that doesn't actually do anything on its own. It requires the presence of some kind of established normal state in order to work. It's only when you deviate from such normality that you create the weird. This concept, the idea that weird fiction isn't a genre unto itself, really just makes it more versatile. It doesn't have all the guidelines or the restrictions of those conventional genres. In fact, you can pretty much just add the word weird to any existing genre and create a new one. There's weird fantasy, weird western, weird horror, weird anything. It's basically just a way of saying to your audience, hey, you'll recognize this, but it's gonna be a little different from what you're used to. And that's really the heart of weird fiction, twisting old, familiar material into something new and strange. We've actually already started work on this month's short story, and while we're definitely not going to be able to use everything on this list, it's still shaping up to be quite a trip. So brace yourselves, and be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss out on the weirdness. As always, thanks for watching, and keep making stuff up. I'll see you next time. Bye!